Okay, now we need to go back to item 9. Item 9, and it's on page 25. And I'm out of order here. Why am I out of order? Where's 9? Hey.
Yeah, after Libet, sorry. Yeah.
Oh, it's there. Thank you. So this report on the intensification plan for the all other locations. We're familiar with the MPSUD. We've dealt with the policy direction on walkable catchments and qualifying matters. And now we need to address the all other locations under policy 3D, I think it was. And the writers of this report are Ryan Bradley, Senior Policy Planner, Chian Lu, Policy Planner, and of course we have in support John Dogood, our General Manager of Plans and Places, and of course Shane, our economist, as well, is with us. I think I'm going to pass to John Dogood.
Kia ora koutou, councillors and members of the committee. So thanks for the introduction, Mr. Chair. This is our second report, as you mentioned, on the NPSUD intensification requirements. So the NPSUD, what is the NPSUD? You're pretty familiar with it after a series of workshops earlier this year, including as recently, I think, as last week. So what we're talking about here is a particular aspect of the NPSUD around a plan change that is required to be notified next August. So as you're aware, there are many other aspects of the NPSUD. So when we say what is the NPSUD, it does direct us to change our regional policy statement and district plan to enable development capacity in the form of building heights and densities of urban form in specified locations. Primarily the district plan part of the Unitary plan, not so much the regional policy statement in terms of this piece of the NPSUD. That purpose there you've heard about before. It is around ensuring that there is capacity so that urban areas can grow and change in response to the needs of the communities. And those intensification policies that influence or really direct the council in terms of this plan change that is required to be publicly notified next August are in policies 3 and 4 of the NPSUD. And then there is subpart 4, which is a sort of procedural process part of the NPSUD, setting up in quite a lot of detail what Auckland Council and other councils, in particular what are referred to as the Tier 1 high growth councils, must do by next August. When we talk about a proposed plan change, it's still proposed by the council at that point. So it will go through a submissions process, further submissions, a hearing in the normal way before a council decision is ultimately made sometime quite a few months, I suspect, after next August. And that process will be open to all Aucklanders to make submissions. But in the next agenda item, we'll talk a bit more about engagement between now and next August, and then a little bit more on the process between August going forward. So that's just a quick bit of context. I'll very shortly hand over to Ryan, Tian and Shane, but last slide for me really is just to recap on that previous report to committee in July. That's the left circle there. We talked in quite a bit of detail about the city centre where we're sitting right now, the 10 metropolitan centres as identified in the Auckland plan and the Auckland Unitary plan. That's the largest centres in Auckland. We talked about the rapid transit stops. That's the train stations on the rail network, but also the stations on the North Shore busway. And we also talked about this concept of walkable catchments. And in July, you did give us an approach as officers to go and do some work with walkable catchments of 800 metres or thereabouts from the rapid transit stations and from the 10 metropolitan centres and 1,200 metres from the city centre. So those approaches have been agreed, and this is the next piece of the NPSUD and the final piece in terms of setting that initial direction for us as staff to get on and do the work and then come back to you and local boards and mana whenua later in the year. It's around these all other locations, and that's a phrase that's used in the NPSUD. It's not one that we've dreamt up. It's all other parts of urban Auckland that aren't the city centre, the 10 metros and the walkable catchments of those areas and the walkable catchments of the RTN stations. And we do have to allow for intensification in those in those locations based on the level of accessibility to public transport, walking and cycling access to a range of goods and services, and also demand for housing in those locations. And you've had some workshops on this idea of accessibility and relative demand. So I'll hand over to Ryan at this point. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, John. So this is the last limb of Policy 3. So as John mentioned, you've already covered A to C. So this is Policy 3D, and it's last of the intensification directions under this policy, and it states that in all other locations enable in the Unitary Plan building heights and density commensurate with the greater of the level of accessibility by existing or planned active or public transport to a range of commercial activities and community services, and the relative demand, or the relative demand for housing and business use in that location. So the report in front of you seeks endorsement of three things. Firstly, how we are to measure the level of accessibility. Secondly, how we're going to measure relative demand across Auckland. And then the potential intensification response in the Unitary Plan in terms of density and heights based on those first two. So as we go through this today, it's important to bear in mind that we don't have any maps to show you of these areas yet. We haven't determined the areas of high accessibility and demand yet, and that will be done once we have endorsement of a methodology. The intensification response for all other locations will also be influenced by what goes on in the walkable catchments that we talked about before, which are likely to be adjacent to a lot of these areas which will have high demand and high accessibility. And the areas, in terms of the zoning response, it could also be reduced in terms of the height and density if there are qualifying matters that apply to these areas, such as things like volcanic view shafts, natural hazards, and so on. And the last point to know is that we may refine this approach as we go through the process as well. So firstly, looking at how we are determining the level of accessibility across Auckland. So we're currently developing a Gis Analysis Model to measure accessibility. This gives a score to every property in the urban environment, depending on the trip time, to a range of common commercial activities and community services, as the NPS directs us to do. So the model will look at each property and then calculate a trip time using active or public transport to things like jobs, centres, education, supermarkets, convenience stores, medical facilities and parks. And the properties that have the highest level of accessibility will be those with the highest scores. So it will be a relative thing across Auckland. Lots of areas in Auckland will have access to these things, but some areas will have better access than others. So now we'll move on to how we're determining relative demand, and I'll get Tian to take you through these next slides.
Thanks, Ryan. So with relative demand, it's slightly more complicated because the NPS UD doesn't actually define what relative demand is. So there are potentially various ways to determine what we consider to be relative demand. So as part of this work, we have investigated a bunch of measures that could be regarded as relative demand, such as land prices, where building consents are issued, house sales, housing register numbers, homelessness, amenity and family, social and cultural ties. And we got all the stats that we could get and tried to map them out to get a better understanding of how suitable they would be in determining relative demand. After analysis, we determined that some of these were skewed by existing factors. So for example, with building consents, they are skewed by the fact that we are allowing a lot of development in certain areas under the Unitary Plan. So that kind of gives a very confused view in terms of where demand actually is. And some other ones are slightly more difficult to manage. So for example, family, social and cultural ties, we understand that this obviously has a very important factor in some people's decisions of where they want to live. However, these are very subjective and it's very difficult to find data that supports this from a statistical point of view. So based on the assessment that we had carried out, we had determined that land prices were identified as the most suitable and best measurement of relative demand, noting that this is obviously not the perfect way, but in terms of the options available, that this was the most reasonable way to determine what the NPSUD wanted as part of this policy. So the reasons why it was considered that land values are the strongest indicator is because people reveal their preferences, their prices they're willing to pay, and this kind of reflects the idea of desirability or where people would want to live if they had the money or didn't have other influences that affected their ability to live somewhere. This does not mean that there is no demand for housing in areas with lower land values. We acknowledge that there is demand everywhere, but for the purposes of this, it's trying to indicate that in average and in aggregate, more people would want to live in more expensive areas in comparison. Areas with higher land values also tend to be areas with moderate to high accessibility to jobs, also higher amenity and closer to services and other destinations. So as part, going back to what the NPSUD requires us, we also need to formulate an intensification response with regards to what information we get out of the accessibility and density inputs that we put in. The NPSUD is quite clear that an area does not necessarily need to be high accessibility and high demand in order to enable intensification. It could be one or the other, but they have also acknowledged that the areas that meet both are the most prime for intensification. So as part of the response, taking into account what we have discussed, we are proposing to enable a minimum of 2 stories and no density rules in areas of either high demand or high accessibility. That kind of equates to what we currently have in the mixed housing suburban zone, mixed housing urban zone, or terraced housing and apartment zone. And we're also proposing to enable a minimum of 3 stories and no density rules in areas with both high demand and high accessibility, and that relates to our existing mixed housing urban zone and terraced housing and apartment zones. But just as a reminder, just because an area is of high accessibility and high demand does not mean that we automatically just change the zone. It's not just going to be a blanket approach, and there will be a lot of considerations that will be in place when a planning process takes place to actually translate the outputs into spatial implications and the extent of intensification. What we're also proposing are the minimums and not necessarily reflective of all the areas of Auckland. The aspects that will require consideration as part of this planning process will include, as Ryan has mentioned before, qualifying matters which may affect the ability or may limit the extent of intensification in particular areas, natural features and built features that may affect zone patterns and where we draw, natural boundaries, and then also the extent of intensification and walkable catchments will also be a factor, as areas that are next to walkable catchments may be suitable for high intensification, especially depending on how intensive we decide the walkable catchments are going to be enabled. And as just a summary of what Ryan has also mentioned previously, we haven't done any of the accessibility and demand models to date, but will commence once the approaches have been endorsed. Because there's no way to determine that, it's just a reminder that some areas may require a change in zoning, but others may remain the same because as they may already be zoned to enable the anticipated heights. And as work progresses, spatial implications and extent of intensification will be workshopped with the Planning Committee, local boards and mana whenua once assessment and policy analysis is completed. Thank you.
Thank you, Tian. John, anything further?
No, I think that's good. Yep.
Thank you. Thank you all. I will move the A through to E, which is on page 26 of the agenda. Do I have a second, please? Can I have a call for a second? Thank you, Councillor Cooper. So the motion is live, and I'll go to questions first. Councillor Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Look, I understand we may not have a lot of choice to do this work, but in doing so, what evidence of social investment intensification by the Crown do we have with regards to capacities of schools to fund any further growth, hospitals, police in suburban Auckland? And I note that looking at point 23, where the calculating of accessibility is around educational facilities, medical facilities, etc. So there are a lot of parts of Auckland, of course, those schools are at capacity already within our current Auckland Unitary plan. So is the Crown doing investment work themselves, and have you seen the evidence of that to support this?
Through the chair, we meet with Ministry of Education staff in terms of schools quite regularly. They do have a team who are very busy and have been for some time planning for schools in Auckland. As with council, their budgets are constrained, and that there are ongoing challenges there. But they're very attuned to Auckland's growth. They look at zoning issues, but they also look at trends as to where the growth is happening. They work very closely with schools themselves, as you would expect, school boards, principals of schools. They get information from Stats New Zealand to do their planning and investment work. So just in the same way as council and the CCOs do their planning and investment and funding, Ministry of Ed, have a similar process in terms of investing in schools. So we've seen some of that information, but it's their core business as opposed to ours. We can certainly try and bring some of that information in, but in short, they do plan for schools. They do look at zoning, but zoning is only one factor, and this plan change that we're talking about here in the NPSUD is not creating more population, as you know, in Auckland. It's not creating more growth. It's just potentially enabling higher densities and more growth in some areas of Auckland than others than we currently allow in the Unitary Plan. So they will be involved in this process. They are well aware of the NPSUD, and they're following how it tracks through the process. So that's schools, Councillor Simpson. I'm just trying to recall, you mentioned hospitals.
And the other one is around kind of open space too, because I know that's ours, but in a lot of cases, the open space of an area is, people can use a school ground in the weekends and whatever. And I'm just sort of thinking that open space diminishes as soon as you put more buildings and things for schools. I suppose I just wanted to see the other side to the argument, because this is going to come in what I call suburban Auckland, for want of a better word. And there are already constraints around that. So in endorsing this makes me very nervous to endorse this, because I know, for example, in my own backyard, that we have schools at capacity. They're running out of open space in their own school footprint. I mean, I've got a school in my ward that hardly, don't think it's got a blade of grass left, because it's either being built on or using artificial to get the amount of kids to be able to play. So I just want to have some confidence that government's doing its bit, coming to the party 50-50. And we know that already with our own.
So there's consequential work, which I think John is outlining, that we need to be involved with, open space provision and the analysis of that, which we will embark on once this MPS is confirmed. But just in terms of education, I've reached out to the Ministry of Education and I've said, look, a lot of the councillors are interested in what the development program looks like for Ministry of Ed in Auckland. And I think there's going to be a formal approach, if not the formal approach has already gone to the Ministry of Ed, to bring them into a workshop. Again, it's in the list of many workshops, but we will be hearing from the Ministry of Education on their education development program.
In hospitals too. Your North Shore Hospital is pretty full now, let alone this. Now my next question is, if the current residential assessed capacity of our current unitary plan is 840,000 residential dwellings, and the current projected demand for residential dwellings based on Stats New Zealand medium growth in our council's this last LTP is 342,000, we've already got 500,000 homes already, inverted commas, available or spare. So why are we pushing so hard on this when our own plan currently delivers extra housing?
Through the chair, the short answer is that we, staff, Auckland Council, are not pushing hard. It's the government through the NPSUD that is pushing for this approach and not pushing for, they're actually requiring it. So irrespective of the housing and business assessment analysis that you've referred to there that we're required to do, and we were doing anyway under the NPSUD, and irrespective of the capacity in the Unitary Plan, which is significant and certainly enables short, medium and probably long-term growth in Auckland, the NPSUD is absolutely clear that the intensification rezoning is still required by next August. So there is no explicit recognition of if a council has already created enough capacity, it doesn't have to intensify any further. It's a very directive NPS that doesn't have sufficient capacity already in your plan as an out clause, if you like.
It's an ideological idea as opposed to the related.
Okay, thank you, Councillor. Councillor Coombe, your question, please.
Thank you. Kia ora koutou. Thank you for the presentation. I just would like, if you can please, to really clarify in terms of stepping through what will happen in practice as we work towards the recommended plan changes, in terms of the fact that this is just a starting point and in a preliminary approach, so that we could end up with quite different zoning and areas with a mix of zoning. And so in terms of resolving on this, that the starting point for is going to be either mixed housing suburban or mixed housing urban, would it be possible just to simplify? I mean, it is kind of covered in the report, but I just think it would be good to really understand what that will mean in practice as we step through the next stages to actually end up with the zoning that the final zoning changes, because it's not totally clear that this is just a starting point. And I guess, and my other question, part of that is, this is called we're endorsing the following approaches, but it's also been described as the preliminary approach. And if that is the case, why are we just not saying that this is the preliminary approach rather than this doesn't cement the final outcome? It influences the steps that we're going to work through. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Coombe. So I guess just draw attention to recommendation D on page 26 of the agenda, what's on the screen there. Recommendation D is the one around, and we had this in July as well, for the walkable catchments in the city centre and the metros, and that is, as we as staff start to produce some maps and get spatial, if you like, with these approaches, it may be that some of what you're resolving today needs to be refined. Maybe there need to be some further directions and approaches, or these need to be modified, as I say, refined in some sort of way. So we are acknowledging that. And I guess the challenge is there are over 1 million parcels of land in urban Auckland. So this is a really complex jigsaw. It's a 1 million piece jigsaw with an NPS that's 15, 20 pages long and about 2 pages on this stuff here. So we have to sort of convert 2 pages of government policy and apply that to a jigsaw with 1 million pieces. So it's inevitable that, well, first of all, we need a launch pad to sort of start doing the technical work as staff, as planners, as we're sort of trained to do. But then as we work through that exercise, we may find that this isn't quite right. We may need to refine it a bit, at which point, if it's a significant departure, it would need a report back to Planning Committee to amend things, or even a fairly minor departure. But in terms of process, again, it's in recommendation. Well, it's D as well, really. That so D is the one around. That we will be looking to workshop with you as the Planning Committee, inviting local boards. We're not sure of the exact format for that and how we might do that, but certainly some who are involved in the developing unitary plan will be familiar with sessions in the Rendezvous Hotel across the road with all local board members and all Planning Committee and ISB members in the room around local board tables looking at maps. We did that on 2 or 3 occasions. We also had individual sessions with local boards, with ward councillors invited to attend, but it's that sort of process of having very early draft maps that apply these words to the zoning maps, that clearly identify what do the current maps allow in terms of height and density, what do they look like now, how does that link back to the NPSUD, and then that comes back to the Planning Committee for decision-making, formal decision-making at a meeting such as this, probably in February, March next year, and that leads into the next report on the agenda. And just to your other point, I think the next report does talk about engaging with Aucklanders on this preliminary approach, whereas this report here is talking about just an approach as opposed to preliminary. I mean, not too phased either way, whether it's an approach or a preliminary approach. As I mentioned, this approach we've acknowledged may need to be refined. So it's, if you're more comfortable with preliminary, that's fine, because essentially that's what it is.
Yeah.
Because it may be refined as we really start doing the work collectively, staff and elected members.
Thank you. I think it's a really useful clarification. And if I may, Mr. Chair, just so in terms of that preliminary approach and what we'll be working through and looking at the maps, does this resolution also allow us to, we could step back further? So if there are areas that it's not even, it doesn't work to even go to mixed use urban, we might, that could also be modified on the way through as well as greater intensification and greater heights.
Well, that's correct.
Okay, so just
It could
picking
go
up on
either
that.
way. Yeah.
Mixed housing, not mixed use.
Yeah.
Just picking up on that, so the Councillor Kerm, I should say, are you suggesting that in the A it's endorsed the following preliminary approaches?
Ideally, I would have liked to have seen that word there, because that's what we've talked about through the workshops, but we didn't do it when we talked about the walkable catchments, and perhaps in hindsight it might have been good if we had, because I think there's a bit of debate that whereas if we're putting in place now, setting in stone what's going to happen with the changes to the unitary plan, whereas actually we've got a whole lot of steps to work through and debate, and this is just at the very early stage. But
Okay,
I mean,
look,
I think
can
we have
just-
that understanding, but it would have been useful to have highlighted that maybe.
Well, I think I've heard John say that he's comfortable with adding the word preliminary, and I think it's, I'll just check with Chief of Strategy. Councillor Cooper, you're okay if we just add the word preliminary? We'll just cover that off. Thank you.
Through the chair, just we know how tight the timing is, and also the work program you have on. As long as that doesn't require us to come back, say, to confirm, if you know what I mean. So it's we understand it's preliminary, yep, and it may change, but it may not. So we'll just keep going, and we'll work with you through that process. Yeah.
Okay, we'll just add that.
So, just
Back to you,
a very
John.
quick point to note, it does come back to what I mentioned before, that the maps, the outputs of these approaches will come back to you formally before they go out as, in March or April, well before next August. And again, we're getting into the next report. But at that point, if you need to clarify that the approach has been refined through the mapping work, then perhaps there's a resolution at that point rather than have to get into revoking today's resolutions. I can see a pathway forward where we're essentially approving the maps and having some approaches sort of confirmed, modified at that point.
Thank you. Councillor Henderson.
Thanks, Chair. I've got a number of questions, but just to sort of highlight at the outset, I'm extremely uncomfortable with A4, and I'll explain why through the discussion. But yeah, 4 questions. So first and foremost, at a broad level, does the department see the MPS on urban development as an opportunity for more housing or a threat to the unitary plan?
Oh, that was a rhetorical question.
Opportunity or threat?
Sorry, we're in a formal meeting here.
Are we approaching this progressively
it
or
absolutely
defensively?
provides an opportunity, but we will be upfront and say that there are aspects of it that we need to tread very carefully, because they could undo some and compromise some things that Aucklanders value and fought very hard to include in the unitary plan, and they're not explicitly recognised, and I'm not just talking about special character areas, in the NPSUD. So it's both really. I wouldn't call it a threat, but we need to just tread very carefully and make sure we're making decisions that we don't throw some of the good stuff out while enabling more housing. But absolutely, there are some opportunities for more housing in the unitary plan that we will find through this exercise.
The MPS, not the unitary plan. Sorry. Yeah. Did you mean MPS in that answer, or unitary plan? Just to clarify. You said there was opportunities for more housing in the unitary plan.
More opportunities through the NPS that we will find in the unitary, in both.
Yeah, thanks.
It creates opportunities in both. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Just moving on to the question of relative demand, I understand that we haven't done a lot of this work, but I'll just ask in case there's some insight that we do have at this point. Are there any thoughts on where the threshold of what high demand might mean within that assessment? And a follow-up is, what rough proportion of properties do you expect to be of high demand in that assessment, or have we not got there yet?
No, we haven't got to that level of detail yet, but yeah, there will have to be some sort of cut-off point, and we'll have to come back to the committee as we go through. As John mentioned, we'll be coming back with maps, and that's at the point where we'll say where we've drawn the line of what's an area of high demand and also areas of high accessibility and so on, because that's going to be the same thing, that it's going to be a point system across Auckland, so we're going to have to draw the line somewhere on those as well.
Okay, thank you. Which leads me to my next question, which is my concern on A4. Given that we don't have a lot of the information that through the answer that we've just gleaned, is it appropriate to endorse a methodology today in a resolution like this, going as low as 2 stories on desirable land, without the work being done to give us that information first? Why do we actually need to give you a steer on this now?
John.
Yeah, it's again, it's that it's a very large, complex region with a very well thought through, set of zoning that's already there. So we just need something to get us moving. I mean, as staff, I guess we could start doing the work and then bring it to you when we're a bit more advanced. But we just felt that it was really helpful to get a political endorsement of an approach that can be refined as we start doing the work. There's plenty of flexibility here. In terms of 4, I mean, I can see where you're coming to, that, high accessibility, high demand, why only 2 stories? But we haven't said that it stops there. It could be 3 or 5 stories or even higher. So it really is just a bit of a lead. The primary direction we're seeking there, I guess, is that the single house zone would not be appropriate unless there's a very good reason that qualifying matter. So that in itself is quite a significant policy shift relative to the unitary plan that's being foreshadowed here. It's in light of the NPSUD, but just that single statement there, that not the single house zone, is quite a big shift in direction.
Thank you. Supplementary on that, and then one more question. Thank you, Chair. So given that answer, and thanks for that, that's very helpful. If we're talking about areas of high accessibility and high demand, why would we see fit to put mixed housing suburban in that resolution? If we're talking about areas of high demand, 2 stories is fairly low.
John.
Well, again, it's giving a direction to move away from the single house zone if it's present in those areas. A refinement could be when we do the maps that we go, actually, there may be a valid point there that the mixed housing suburban zone isn't appropriate in areas of high accessibility, high demand. I guess, again, it comes down to the point that Ryan made before. We haven't drawn the lines on the map as to where the high accessibility, high demand areas are to know exactly what that's going to look like.
Thank you. And one last question. Thank you, Chair. Thanks, colleagues. Just more of a technical one. On A2, sorry, I just wasn't clear. Removing the influence of zoning on the land value, what does that have? What effect does that have?
If I could get you to clarify, do you mean what effect does it have, or what does it mean?
Yeah, I'm not quite understanding A2. Yeah, what's the meaning of the resolution? That's what I'm asking.
I suppose what it's saying is using land value and for relative demand, you're comparing land values in 2 different places, and their absolute number doesn't matter. Their relative number matters. So when we say we're stripping out or removing the influence of zoning, what that means is there would be certain areas of the city that don't have, say, terrace house and apartment building zoning. But we're able to estimate what those places, what that zoning would be worth if it was in those areas using common statistical econometric techniques, which I'm happy to talk to you about for 2 hours sometime, but not now. So there are robust ways you can do this. So it's really saying if all of the areas of the city had the same mix of zonings, what would the relative values of the land be? And then saying, What you don't want to do is say, well, there's FAB zoning in this one area of the city and single house zoning in this other area of the city, and say, well, see, one is more expensive than the other. Is that because it's more desirable, or because what you can do with the land? And so it's removing that impact.
So sorry if I can paraphrase, just clarifying. So if we're looking at relative demand, we would use our analysis and say we'd look at a single house in Massey, we'd look at a single house in Epsom, and we'd see which ones were more expensive and we'd go from there. Does that make sense?
Essentially, that's the idea.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks.
All right.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Sayers, your call.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Two questions. One's around the effect that this could have on special character area overlays. Is there any comment you can make there about, does it impact or change?
Through the chair, so it's really it's our recommendation C, which is a reference back to the Planning Committee's decision last month on qualifying matters, where you agreed that special character areas should be a qualifying matter where they're of high quality, and the survey work that the Heritage team are doing will start to do map the areas that are of high quality, high architectural integrity, and so on. So it's a link back to that resolution there that will explain the approach for special character areas. So we're essentially saying same approach for all other areas, which this report is dealing with, as the approach that we discussed and agreed, and the committee agreed in July for special character. So if it's of high quality, it would be retained. But if it's of low to moderate quality through houses having been demolished over the years, very unsympathetic alterations that really are impossible to modify, the original form of the house is essentially gone. New housing, if you've got streets in the special character overlay that have a significant amount of that sort of development in them, then they're not going to be assessed as being of high quality, and therefore the resolution last month would indicate that they should be open to whatever zoning is appropriate given its location, its accessibility and its demand.
Okay, thanks, John. And my other questions are, because I can only read, I know my ward better than I do other wards. So the question is, and I know we haven't identified centres yet, but the experience that Kimu had when the special housing areas went in there, and now the traffic congestion that we've got through there, and being a state highway and NZTA, central government, not having any investment plan to fix that, it worries me that township, out of all the townships in my particular ward, is the one that kind of wouldn't want to end up targeted. So, and maybe it could be when it goes through the criteria. So I guess my question's around, do those considerations of what existing townships pressures might be under form any part of the decision-making process? And I guess more specifically, Chris, I'm trying to ask, is Kimu Huapai likely to be caught up in this and further intensification done in that particular area of Auckland?
Councillor, you're suggesting it's highly accessible?
No.
Well, yeah, and through Chair, that's probably the key issue there in terms of the recommendations, is that if an area like Kumiahuapai is not deemed to be highly accessible or of high demand relative to other suburbs and parts of Auckland, then it's out of scope for any changes here. We're really dealing with areas that are either high demand or high accessibility or both. And the high demand, remember, is relative to all other places in Auckland, so on a land value basis. So it's potentially an area that may not meet the threshold for the changes that we're suggesting the NPSUD requires. The other aspect is that, again, it's recommendation C today, that reference back to resolution PLA 2021-80 last month around qualifying matters. You did agree to qualify matter that where there are significant infrastructure constraints, that will be a reason not to, potentially, to not enable intensification beyond what's already allowed in the Unitary plan. So I think there are two potential safeguards for areas that are constrained in terms of transport, accessibility and infrastructure. Yep.
Okay, I think
But
that's
but can't give you a categorical kumia huapai is out of scope for the NPSUD. No.
it's a helpful question, I think, regionally anyway, John, so thank you for that. Thank you, Mr Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Sayers. Councillor Newman, please.
Yeah, I mean, it's to a certain it's a bit like the question that Councillor Henderson asked you before, actually, why we would at this stage in Roman numeral 4, second sentence, include the word "not the single house zone." I mean, why do we have to add that as an exclusion at this point? Right now, I mean, you're wanting a stair. Why wouldn't they be included? I mean, the risk here, isn't there, that the level of capacity that we will discover will actually be in those locations that are already pretty saturated, and that they have significant constraints. There's a lot of high concentration of people and some low amenity in some of those those mixed housing suburban zones. And I would have thought that there are plenty of locations, high demand and highly accessible in the single house zone, and yet they've got those words there. Why is that?
John.
Yes, maybe just to talk to that in a bit more detail. And so what we're saying is in areas of either high accessibility or high demand, then we should be enabling some intensification, some additional opportunities for housing. If we retain the single house zone, it's not doing that at all. It's a constraining zone in terms of capacity. Whatever's built there now, very limited opportunity to create any additional dwellings with that zoning. Mixed housing suburban, and also to Councillor Henderson's point before, is very flexible in terms of density, and we're actually seeing, what's been referred to in the past as gentle intensification, where you're not seeing apartment buildings, but you are seeing a lot of growth and opportunities for housing through the mixed housing suburban zone because of the removal of density planning rules that used to exist in the legacy district plans in the region. So by that single stroke of removing the density control from that zone, even though it's only 2 stories, it's creating a lot of opportunities for housing and intensification. But to the point of the single house zone, I guess we would see that in areas of high accessibility, high demand, to retain that flies in the face of the NPSUD, unless there's a qualifying reason, such as high quality special character, to retain it.
And so your subsequent investigation at some point, I would assume that you would identify that a lot of those single house zones, actually they haven't been well capitalised because of the zoning provisions. But if that were to change, the market demand to significantly capitalise them would probably lend itself to an argument to go beyond 2-storey. Would that be reasonable?
Yeah, just not sure I'm entirely following the logic there. Yes, if the zoning has changed, then the opportunities created, and we'll almost certainly see some change in high demand, highly accessible areas. Does that automatically mean we should be jumping to 3 stories? I think that's something that we need to do more work on, and we've not foreclosed that opportunity by saying the approach might need to be refined, and also by leaving it open for, it could be mixed housing suburban 2 stories, it could be mixed housing urban 3 stories, or in these places of high accessibility, high demand, it could be the 5-6-storey terrace housing apartment building zone. And when we look at the maps, we'll find many places where where these areas of high accessibility, high demand already enable 3, 4, 5, 6 stories or more. So, yeah.
And my one final question, Chair, if you don't mind, just to clarify, the NPS is not about increasing the volume of affordable housing, it is about increasing the volume of housing. The affordability of it is another matter, but fundamentally this is about trying to move the barriers to increase supply. Would that be a fair summation?
Well, the NPSUD does draw a link between relaxing density controls and height controls and affordability. So, I mean, we have presented to you previously about some economic evidence that shows that certainly in the Auckland context with the unitary plan as it stands, there's not necessarily a strong argument there, but the NPSUD itself does draw a link between capacity for housing and affordability.
Increased supply assumes that there'll be an increased supply and the equilibrium for the price will change as a result.
But I suppose, sitting here with Shane, our economist, who's far better placed to talk to those sort of factors than I am.
Councillor, do you want, would you like Shane, our economist, to recount that? Okay, you're good. Okay, thank you. Councillor Hills, please.
Kia ora. Thank you. Shane and I have talked to some of our colleagues, and I don't think there is appetite to change that first part of the 4. But I guess, does it, even though you say it's a start, do you think it complies with the MPSUD to have the 2 stories in the either or situation? Do you think we're at risk at starting at a place we might not comply with the government's policy statement?
Yeah, I suppose we are.
To 2 stories, though.
Through the chair, we are picking up on. So I guess what we forget sometimes is that some of the other Tier 1 and certainly Tier 2 councils, so the Tier 1 are the high growths, that's the Christchurch, Wellington, Hamilton, Tauranga and Auckland. And it's not just the city councils there, it's also some of the district councils within those regions are having to go through this Tier 1 approach as well of 6 stories within walkable catchments and so on. A lot of those district plans have density restrictions in their residential zones, in all of their residential zones. Even the highest density residential zones will say no more than 1 dwelling per 150 square metres. In Auckland, that was removed through the Unitary Plan process. So we've already taken a big leap in the direction of enabling more housing, enabling more density, and yes, it's only 2 stories, but it's still a heck of a lot more flexible than what was available under the old district plans. So is it failing to comply with the NPSUD? Well, while the NPSUD is very prescriptive around 6 stories in the walkable catchments, it's not prescriptive about these other locations. It leaves it some flexibility to the council, which is great that it's done that. But what will happen is this will all be tested through submissions and evidence in hearings. And so whatever council does, I'm almost certain there will be submissions and arguments that we've either gone too far with height and density and not far enough, and there'll be a sweet spot in the middle. So I think as we do the work, look at the maps, again, as I say, it may be that we feel, well, actually, now that we've defined the accessible high demand areas, maybe 3 stories is more appropriate. But at this point, we just don't feel we have enough information to get there yet.
Thank you. And do we have any you've obviously got the maps and stuff work underway probably, but do you have any ideas of what sort of capacity increases you're looking at a high level, or you're not? Because it's still hard to make a decision without knowing generally, is it another 3 to 500? Is it 50,000 to 70,000? Where are we sitting in the...
Yeah, unfortunately, we'd love to sort of give you an indication, but we can't really. It's just too early. But that's going to be a really core part of planning committee decision making, particularly in March, April, when we look into, or when we're recommending that we do engage with Aucklanders on some maps, and certainly prior to next August, that information around what additional capacity has been created will be a key factor. So we can do that work. But we haven't defined the edges of the walkable catchments yet. You've just said generally 800 and 1,200 metres. But you said there are modifying factors like severance by motorways, topography, that might mean that it's far less than 800 metres in many cases. We haven't done the work around special character, and that'll be a biggie in terms of how much of the special character areas are high quality. If significant parts of special character are high quality, then that will have a big impact on the capacity. So, yeah, we'd love to present something, but I think it's really risky to start speculating as to what additional capacity your decisions or your approaches in July might enable, and now these approaches here. So, yeah, we will definitely provide the committee and local board members, mana whenua and Aucklanders with that sort of information. We can do it. It's just we haven't done the work yet.
Thank you, Chair. 2 more questions, sorry. You've got a really, really good climate impact statement here around, the fact that intensification reduces emissions, that people closer to everything we don't have situations like Councillor Sayers talked about where you are stuck with no public transport. How much will you be delving into that on the different mix of what you're going to, everything we're asking you to do is looking at reducing emissions now. Will you be elevating that through this process of, okay, if we are going to do more mixed housing suburban, that actually would increase our emissions compared to if we were doing mixed housing urban? Is that sort of work going to be part of what comes through the plan change?
I'll see if the team can add to this, but it's not something I've specifically thought about, but we do, there are techniques to model vehicle emissions based on growth plans, the Unitary plan and so on. So we'll certainly tap into, our experts in Jacques Victor's area, Chief Sustainability Office, to see if there is some sort of emissions type modelling, so we can compare this scenario with another scenario with the status quo and see what the different emissions profiles might be. It's pretty complex stuff. It's computer modelling. It's pretty sophisticated stuff. But it's certainly a good idea if it can be done in the time frame. Others sort of add to that? No.
And with the plan change, will we have the ability, when these things come forward, that you can further look at things like front yard setbacks, things like that? If we're going to have more mixed housing urban, why would we require this wasted land at the front where you could be, are we going to be a bit bolder in the thinking that will make, not have these setbacks which take up land, reduce the amount of housing and also reduce the amount of green space, because we're forcing people to have these tiny front yards when they could be having a large backyard or whatever it is? Is that going to be included in this, or are we just going to rezone things?
Yeah, so the parallel piece of work that's happening is looking at the residential development controls, which are front yards, building coverage limits, height in relation to boundaries, so outlook, outdoor living space. So the urban designers and planners and the team have been working with our consents team, and so we are going to bring a report or workshop with the committee, I think in September, October, a report to committee on some improvements that we think may well be justified to those controls. So it will be within the scope of that work. So yes, we are looking to potentially do a plan change on not just the intensification, but improvements to design. And so we can pick that up and look at the front yard issue as part of that.
Work to do in that area too. Councillor Fletcher.
Well, to a degree, I think my question was asked by Councillor Henderson. I was going to pose it on the basis, and I'm not in denial over the ability for government to do what it wants to do, but are we pushing back, given the amount of pain that went into the Unitary plan? Do you feel, as elected members, we have highlighted the difficulties as effectively as we might? We've got the Minister of Finance coming next Monday for an informal session. How can we make the most of our ability to just highlight, having nursed a dementia patient for 5 years, sometimes you'd find everybody else doing crazy things around them because they became the centre of attention. But, it just seems insane to me. We know that these timelines are ridiculously short. We know that this is complex beyond belief. What more could we be doing? Not to say that we're just opposed to change, but just to do it properly. This just strikes me as nuts.
John, it's a question I've asked of you.
It's a very unfair question, and you can choose to ignore it if you like. But
no, I think it's definitely worth asking. Look, we did submit on the draft, as you know. We said that even the draft looked a bit too directive, too prescriptive. There should be more flexibility. Auckland has done a lot of this already, but we've ended up with an MPS UD that's pretty prescriptive, and the timelines are pretty tight. But as I mentioned before, there are definitely some opportunities in Auckland where we don't allow as much growth as professionally I think we probably should, and so there is an opportunity here to to identify those and go through a process to potentially enable that growth. I think as we start doing the work and perhaps as if we do find as a council this is all becoming too complex to do it properly, you know, there may be an opportunity to speak to government about timeframes and so on. Next August is the deadline, but you know, there are things like the light rail potential project. You know, how do we deal with that? Is there an argument that maybe there's a phasing of this
Staging, phasing?
Possibly, but at this stage, you know, we believe we can get the work done in time for next August, but it's going to mean a pretty tight engagement process with Aucklanders. So yeah, there's probably not much more that I can add. Technically, we believe we can do the work in the time frame. Subject to one qualification there, and that is the survey of the special character areas. The team have been out for about 5 or 6 weeks doing the work. They're making really good progress, but you know, more than 20,000 properties to survey from the street, not going onto any private property, is a big ask. So that's the one thing we do identify that in this report, that there is some risk of engaging with Aucklanders next March and April and then delivering by next August because of the work on special character. So that's probably all I can really say.
The second question that I had, when we're looking at the calculation of accessibility and so forth, is educational facilities. Now, from my experience of communities experiencing growth, and certainly in areas where education has been to the forefront of people's minds, I found that the Ministry of Education were a bit slack at really understanding the staging. You know, you start with early childhood, you then go on to primary, you then go on to sort of intermediate, secondary school, and they'd get one part right, but not realise that children actually entirely logically age. You know, is there a way that we can start putting a little more detail in and around some of these more general thoughts?
Yeah, so in terms of the modelling that we'll be doing for accessibility, we've just given you a broad headline there of education, but we are looking at primary schools, secondary schools, universities, kindergartens and so on. They'll all be in the model. There'll be various points allocated to each thing, so there'll be weightings and so on given to different criteria. As I said, I think at the workshop earlier, that it would be likely that we haven't decided the weightings yet, but it would be likely that most weightings would be on things like jobs rather than schools, open space. They'd have a lesser weighting when it comes down to it, but we haven't actually got to that detail yet.
Thank you, Councillor Fletcher. I think that exhausts the questions. Ryan, I did ask you a question about, I think it was Monday, just about definitions under the A Roman 1, and just was there any value in including cultural institutions? But and what I meant by that is, you know, cultural institutions like libraries. You know, communities need proximity to libraries. But are you assuming that libraries are actually within centres, so that's taken care of? The other one was we've got the open space, but I was thinking, and I think you came back to me and you said that there's an assumption that it's actively used open space. This is not open space conservation zone. This is open space activity, recreation activity zone. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about open space.
Yeah, that's right. So we're talking about parks that you can actually go and kick a ball around, throw a frisbee, have a picnic, that sort of thing, walk the dog, but not sort of cover basically all the active and sports and active recreation zone, the informal. Yeah, so most of those will be on our sports and active recreation zone. Then we've got the informal recreation zone, which is more of the neighbourhood parks, which have a playground and so on. But we're not including things like esplanade reserves, conservation areas, where stormwater ponds and so on, where they are actually zoned open space, but the recreation value of those is not as high as, say, a park where you can actually go and kick a ball and play on a playground. So we're manually, unfortunately, there's no great data set that gives us what we want, so we're having to manually go through and check all the maps and delete out stormwater ponds and so on.
Okay,
And sorry, in terms of libraries, yes, so most of the libraries will be in the centre zone.
in the centres.
Yeah.
Okay, and on the A Roman 4, in residential zones, it begins in residential areas. So we've got single house zone, mixed housing suburban, mixed housing urban, THAB, but I'm just thinking of residential large lot. So there's another category of residential large lot. We often forget about that. So when you are referring to in residential areas of either high accessibility or demand, are you also encompassing the residential large lot there? Because you do say residential areas.
Yes, yeah, the large lot is inside the rub mostly, but it's right on the edge, so I think it's probably unlikely it would be an area of high demand and high accessibility, but it would be included in that if it did.
Still going to get tested?
Yep.
Yep. Okay, good.
So we cover the full urban environment, which is basically everything inside the rub, plus the larger rural settlements like Warkworth, Pukekohe, Kimihuapai.
Okay, and just to be clear, the qualifying matters, and we added one qualifying matter of special character overlays, they trump things, they trump the provisions, so they still stand. And that's subject to the work we've got to do on the special character analysis or assessments. Okay, I've got further questions. Councillor?
Any comments?
We have a question, further question?
A brief question here.
Councillor Hills, and then I think Councillor Fletcher and Councillor Henderson. It's a comment.
Sorry, Chair. Just on the infrastructure, we make a lot of assumptions around here of what, Councillor Simpson made a comment around North Shore Hospital. There's currently a build for 120 beds, elective surgery being built right now. There's a school, we're going to the opening next Friday, which had a roll of 68 a couple of years ago, and the school is being built for 800 kids in Northcote. So could we have, if it's possible, just a bit more information when it comes back to us about what is being built and supplied for? Because it's not perfect everywhere, but I know there's a ton of new health and education facilities being built, and also maybe what the cost of building those in sprawl suburbs that don't exist yet compared to renewing or building new in the current intensifying areas as well. Just because we talk about the cost, but I don't know that we compare the cost much. Thank you.
Thank you. John's nodding affirmatively there. Councillor Fletcher.
Mr. Chairman, as we go forward on this, I would like to see it recorded in the resolutions as this body of work builds up, that there is recognition of the practical difficulties around the time restraints that we're working to, and that become a matter on the paper trail of this, that becomes a matter of record, that if it all goes to putty at some future point, that this was anticipated, that we knew that this was unrealistic, and that we used every opportunity we could to bring advocacy to this. Now, I'm not sure if there was an appetite around the table to do it, how that would be expressed, but it's just, if you can imagine a politician in 10 years' time looking back on these minutes, they'd say, oh, well, and nobody was really complaining about it. Nobody was drawing attention to the fact that this was unrealistic. I think maybe officers could think about, without compromising yourself, because you're in an awful position. You don't want to admit you can't do something, but by the same token, what are we forgoing because we are putting all this energy into something that's not necessarily achievable? So I don't think we can resolve it now, but I would ask you to be mindful of making sure for the record that we are putting every opportunity we can to talk about the delivery and, the unrealistic nature of this.
So your question has been my question as well over the last couple of months. And in fact, I posed this question to both the General Manager of Plans and Places and the Chief of Strategy when we're forming up the budget. I actually said, do you have the resources to hire the people to respond to the MPS? And we confirmed those budgets, and as we've moved towards this next stage, responding to 3D of the MPS, that's another question I posed just recently to both Chief Strategy and John. Can we achieve this, but also achieve it by delivering a quality outcome, not just any outcome, a quality outcome, a well-considered and well-informed and well-evidenced outcome. And John's response to me recently is we're on target to do that, and it's tight. So if something changes, we will know about it, and we'll respond accordingly. But it is something that the whole team, and you, Councillor Fletcher, myself, we are very aware of, because I do not want to see us in a position where we don't deliver a quality, enduring outcome. And I think that's your point.
You know, if you look back at Legacy Auckland City, whether there were other imperatives, there are some buildings that we simply cannot be proud of.
Yeah.
So I just think that we could have noting the very difficult timelines, or just some qualification on these resolutions, so that people reading them can understand the pressure that people are being put.
Well, my understanding from John, you're not concerned at this stage, though. I think you're not concerned. It's a big task, but we've got the human resource, we've got the budget, and then the MPS says do this by X date. At this time, you're not signalling, you haven't signalled to me that there is a possible issue. But if that does arise, then we can look at it. Am I right in that regard, John, that you're not signalling an issue at this time?
Well, if we can just jumping forward to the next report really briefly, if you look at page 51 on your agenda, we have identified this risk around timeframes under the engagement report. So doing the technical work required to do the zoning changes to overlays in the Unitary plan, that we feel we can deliver by next August. There's no requirement to engage with Aucklanders prior to next August, but in the next report, item 10, we're saying it's best practice. It's a significant change for some parts of Auckland, it's likely to be. So we are recommending that there is engagement in March or April. And the challenge there is, can we get enough of the work done by next March or April, which is well in advance of next August. So it's really the engagement, which isn't required under the NPSUD in terms of all of Aucklanders, that does present some risks. So item 9 that we're on now, yes, technically the work can be done by next August. Item 10, where we're recommending engage with Aucklanders, there is some risk in relation to surveying all of the special character areas. We're on track to do all of the character areas in the walkable catchments, but when you go into all other locations, you're going into places like Devonport, Northcote Point, Greylin, many other suburbs with special character that aren't in the walkable catchments, and surveying that and getting that work done in time to put out something to Aucklanders next March or April, there's some risk there. So we've flagged up the risk in the body of the report. It's just not in the recommendations. But it's in the body,
so
body of item 10.
This is probably where the politics needs to take over, and I appreciate your viewpoint and representing the staff, but I think there does need to be something that reflects the political concern, the early concern.
Not just some risk, I'd say it's significant risk. And these are our resolutions as elected members. Yeah. And I think we must anticipate, based on the experience we've had, that there are risks here. And it will backfire on this council and the trust in local government if we don't signal them.
Members, would you like to cast your eye over the F there, which I think reflects this discussion that Councillor Fletcher has raised. It's something that I've been talking to John about. So it's not too loaded. We're just signalling that there's a few concerns. I don't think we need to add significant at this time because we don't know the degree of those concerns. Yeah. Are we comfortable with that, including that, members? Okay. We're still on questions, and we've concluded questions now. Councillor Simpson.
Quickly, we've looked at accessibility, demand, building heights and density. Where does infrastructure fit in? You know, lack of below the ground infrastructure to take on more than what we've got currently planned in the AUP?
Councillor Simpson, that's through recommendation C, that intensification in these locations of high accessibly high demand may be limited by qualifying matters, one of which you agreed was significant infrastructure constraints. Acknowledge that that is not that well defined at this point in time. You certainly wouldn't base it on the fact that a local school is currently at capacity, but that is a consideration. But in terms of pipes and so on, if there are significant constraints, and we're working with Water Care and Auckland Transport to look at, can we identify areas that would be so significantly constrained that it would be very unwise to allow for any more growth than your Unitary plan allows. So in short, it is covered by your previous resolution, but I acknowledge we need to bring you a bit more detail on that and bring Water Care and AT into the workshopping. Yep.
So can I just ask one more to supplementary? Because I was very nervous, and I thank Councillor Coombe for putting whatever she did, the word of the adjective is before something or other approaches, temporary, whatever they are. But so you're going to make sure that before we get this, we know what's below the ground, we know the schools and hospitals, and we've got all that information before we make the call. Is that correct? Is that part of or are we just going to take the bit that the planning bit of us? We're going to have, I just want to know, I want to have all the bits in the puzzle before I make the call.
Yeah, as I say, as staff, we're working with Auckland Transport and Water Care in particular, and we do engage with and meet with MOE, Ministry of Education as well, on planning issues, growth in Auckland. So we will bring the best information we can that we have as a council family on water supply, wastewater, obviously healthy waters, stormwater and open space as well. So we will certainly, good integrated planning is looking at your infrastructure and your land use together. Yep.
Thank you. We'll conclude the questions and thank the staff. We can move away from the table now. And do I have any speakers in debate on this item? Councillor Henderson, start.
Thank you, Chair. I'm wondering if we can separate out A4 because, frankly, I just don't support it, and I'd like to explain a little bit more why. Look, I like a lot of what I've heard today, and it's a bit of a shame to throw out the entire section, so I want to make very clear what I'm not supporting within that big paragraph. Look, I'm glad the single house zone will be done. I'm glad that we're talking this question on land value and accessibility. That's all good stuff. Where I struggle is to endorse an approach that doesn't have enough information yet. That's the first point. I think we need more information to really give staff a steer on this kind of stuff. And listening to my gut on this, I think it just doesn't go far enough to provide housing for young people in places they most want to live. I don't really know why we don't just go 3 stories rather than 2 stories and 4. I don't know why we need to specify mixed housing suburban at this early stage as an option. I speak from personal experience. I've shared this a few times before, but I live in a 3-storey townhouse myself with 2 young kids. It's a great community. I know my neighbours. It's a great place to, walk to school. It's safe and idyllic and beautiful. That's something that we can share across the whole city, that kind of typology, and it really works for young families. So I was scanning this morning through my Unitary plan maps, and goodness me, if I can speak from experience again in the Waitakere ward, Massey is mainly mixed house urban. Goodness me, famously poor for access to jobs and transport. We talk about the Northwest all the time around here about how it needs more services, and it has more housing intensification than nearly every other community in Auckland. Te Atatu Peninsula has huge amounts of terraced housing and apartment zones, and it's a peninsula. There's only one way in and out of it, and people are really struggling there. Despite the issues that intensification is causing for those local communities, we understand that we have to do our bit. I actually don't get a lot of community resistance around this kind of stuff. I get a lot of concern, sure, but communities understand that we have a housing crisis. They understand that people are sleeping in cars and we need to do all we can. But the pain, in my view, is unevenly spread across Auckland. And our current situation is unfair on suburban Auckland. It just isn't working. But there's good news. The MPSUD around the corner. And I think that's a very positive development for Auckland. And I really want to endorse this approach. That's a really, really important discussion because with the sort of rules we're setting today and in the future, you can lock in socioeconomic outcomes. You can lock in demographics for generations in suburbs. You can make an area more wealthy. You can put less young people or more young people in it. You can put less young families in it or more. Those are the kind of discussions we're really having. This is the most important discussion we're having today. I want to make that very clear. With more varied housing typologies in central city areas in particular, we can better meet demand for homes for young families, and we can make a positive difference for Auckland into future generations. You know, I do struggle with voting against 4, but I feel that I kind of have to do it. We're at such an early stage. We have analysis to gather, we've got more data, we've got maps to look at, discussions between ourselves and the community. I don't know where that's all going to land for me or for all of us, but I'm just struggling to figure out how do I give these concerns over? And the only way that I can see it is to do it with my vote. And lastly, I want to finish up by saying, look, I want to take a positive approach to this. I want the MPS to work for Auckland and enable fairness in housing provision across all of Auckland. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. And Councillor Hills, please.
What he said. Thank you, Chair. Some of the conversations that I've heard on the MPSUD, I don't actually know if people know how hard it is to live in the city, to rent in the city, to buy in the city. The fact there are still 40,000 people on housing waiting list and Kāinga Order would like more density to allow for homes for people. I want to read you this one stat from the census. In 1991, 61% of people aged 25 to 29 owned their own home. By 2018, this had dropped to 44%. Similarly, for those in their late 30s, the rate has dropped from 79% of people owning their own home to 59%. That was 2018. That was before we had last year, which increased housing costs by about 25%. The people who are renting now in Auckland barely can get by, let alone save for a house. My sister was able to buy a house, but well outside of where we live, miles away. I barely see her, and it's pretty sad because she lives so far outside of where we grew up. People are not buying houses, and it's going to get harder and harder and harder. And those that are buying houses are buying them on the fringes of our city where there is no public transport, and we cannot afford. We know, we looked at this 10-year budget and we cannot afford the community assets, let alone the awesome projects that are underway, like the Eastern Busway has been delayed, the last points of that. The issue we have here is providing housing opportunities for people. This is not forcing people to live in anything, but it's giving them opportunities to live somewhere. I'm on the same mind of Councillor Henderson. I'm concerned with the first part of 4. Around the mixed housing suburban. If we are going to, and I know what is coming, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't protect heritage, but I know there's going to be still a lot of heritage protection, and many will argue that is a good thing, and I think that is a good thing that we protect some heritage. But the fact is, in the other areas, if we relegate to mixed housing suburban, we will be I believe we will be ultra vires, I don't know what the word is, but I don't think we will be actually doing what we're supposed to do on the MPSUD. I know that's going to come to us in the next few months, but we keep talking about maybe pushing back on this, and I got told off for mentioning the politics of it last time, but the government supports this, but also the National Party support this, and they want it to go faster and stronger. So we don't have a decision here. This is a cross-party political thing and central government telling us that we have to provide more housing options. So the issue is that we could ignore it, which obviously we're not, or they'll do it for us. And that's happened to us over and over again in this history. And if in 10 years we do look back And I'm going to be concerned that in 10 years we do look back and that we've created a sprawling city where young people cannot live. And young people are going to continue to try and buy properties, but that may be in Australia where housing is far cheaper and there are far more options around cities and around public transport than we are providing. So I just want to be careful here. I know that the discussions, a lot of people think this is going too fast, but just go talk to some people who are in dire housing situations, whether that's trying to get into a Kāinga order house, whether that's trying to afford the rent in Auckland, or whether that's trying to somehow magically buy a house at some point in your life. So, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Mulholland.
Oh, thanks, Chair. I'll carry on discussions and as everyone's having a bit of a say. You know, my concern is that essentially, Chair, that government are laying this on us. And it's great to listen to my colleagues. I always enjoy that because it does change my mind quite frequently. Not saying that I can't make a decision, of course, but, you know, I really, that's what I really enjoy about the debate. But I want to say that I feel it's being forced upon us by central government, and I think the team do an incredible job. I've seen a lot of intensification. In fact, since being a councillor, it's the thing I have to deal with the most. I thought it would be roads and rubbish and so forth. But no, it's intensification. So I think we're doing a really good job. Not that I agree with all of the intensification in my area, but anyway, I also take the point that people can't afford homes, but I had to live on 2-minute noodles and women's products for a long time to afford the deposit for my first home in downtown Hamilton. So, you know, yep, it's a hard slog and you have to give it your heart and soul. So I hear what's happening and I see it too. So just I feel that it's being forced upon us again, somewhat similar to the sort of Three Waters principle, but that's a view. Thanks.
Thank you. Other comments on this one, members? Look, I think we're just about there, but this is, as the words have been changed, this is our preliminary approach. We're working this up. We're looking for the evidence. And look, as we spoke of earlier, we've got to make sure that whatever comes out of this is an enduring and quality outcome. You know, we are talking about the form of Auckland here. And we've given the initial direction on the walkable catchments, city centre, metro centres and the RTN connect station areas and the qualifying matter of special character. But I can't help but think people, even once this is landed, and we heard, and I take you back to the presentation on the housing capacity assessment that we had at our last meeting, there's actually some 900,000 dwelling units made feasible by the current plan now. While we will do this work, and I think it's a good move overall, this is actually not going to build houses. People don't live in planning provisions and they don't live in consents. They actually live in physical houses. And one of the greatest challenges in Auckland now is actually developing it's the constructability, the resources, human in that area. That's one of the enormous challenges. I'm not discounting the MPS-UD by any means, because there is evidence that since 2016, people do want to live in proximity to rapid transit, to city centre and metro centres. They do want to be connected to their friends, to jobs, etc. And that's something that we've learned, and those first decisions are definitely, I think, reflecting on market demand that has changed dramatically since 2015-16 through to now. But let's do this work, but let's do it well. And if we run into any roadblocks or barriers in terms of the capacity of our staff to do this well, we'll have that signalled, well telegraphed to us early in the new year. At this stage, we're tracking reasonably well, but we do have a few political concerns about doing it as well as our communities expect us to do it. But I'm commending these for absolute support. There's a long way to go on this, and a lot of discussion around this table to be had before we get anywhere near firming something up that can show us the yield that is going to come out of our response to the National Policy Statement on Urban Development. Councillor Simpson.
Thanks, Chair. Look, I don't like this at all, to be honest, if I was really fair. I'm with you. I believe we have capacity within our own Auckland Unitary Plan, but it's being foisted on us, and I suppose I'm not sure how to vote because there's a part of me that just says no. But there again, we have to do it. So what's the best of a bad situation is really where I'm coming to. And I think at the end of the day, the final decision is the final decision. So I really support the last recommendation that's just been put up, the amendment, noting how challenging it is, but I really do worry about the rest. I do, and I'm very tempted just to probably abstain. Yeah, well, you've got to endorse, and that's what you want to do. But I'm going to abstain just because I'm not comfortable with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Simpson. And Councillor Cooper, your call.
Just quickly, so I do support this because as everyone said, we haven't identified a lot of the areas because we're just determining the way it's going to be approached. And so we'll have another ability. I mean, we've got lots of steps in plan changes. Many steps. And so for me, this is kind of giving us something for our staff to go away and work on. And we keep talking about there's a hurry. If we don't give them the direction, then they can't get on with it. So I've no doubt there'll be some changes, but it might be that it is identified. Actually, we have met a lot of these standards that we're talking about already. We've got a big bunch of 440,000 dwellings that the Unitary Plan gave us. And so I'm hoping in some ways that though there'll be some more intensification with some of the qualifying matters, we may already meet meet a lot of this without causing too much ruckus, I hope, but also meeting the needs of giving people housing.
Thank you, Councillor. Are we debated? We finished? We are. Thank you. Good conversation, good debate on that one. And of course, this has been well informed by a lot of discussion at workshops as well. And grateful to the local board chairs or their alternates being part of that discussion that's led to these recommendations today. Put it to the vote. Sorry, Deputy Mayor, we will go back to you. I did say I was going to put it to the vote, but we have had some connection issues with the Deputy Mayor, and he's definitely stayed on the call all the way. So I would like to go back to him with your consent, members. Are you comfortable? Go back to the Deputy Mayor. Deputy Mayor, your call, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I really apologise for my connection problems. It's the first time this has happened, so it'll be the last too. I'm just going to be very, very quick. If we don't stay at the table and carry on the discussions we're doing now and be showing good intent here, this will be done to us, which will give us a far worse outcome. I'm really important. Let's stay in the tent, let's keep on with the mahi and get on with it as best we can and illustrate and show with facts and data our concerns and constraints. But let's keep there, otherwise we will be done to. Cheers.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Hear to that. And we'll now go to the vote. All those in favour say aye. Aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no.
Chair, sorry.
Sorry, there'll be things that some of us wish to note. So
Can we let Kalinda know? Sorry.
Yeah.
Can we let Kalinda know?
Oppose A4.
Yeah. Thank you.